Okay. Please tell me how he came to Ashland.
By car.
And what year did you start working at the college?
1968.
What were you a history professor?
Assistant professor of history then. I was hired by George Oliver, who had a sudden resignation. A man took a job at another school in April, and I was still in graduate school, so he called the chairman at UVA. The chairman at UVA knew I was interested in a small school, and that's how we got together.
Were you living in another town or something?
Charlottesville.
Was that a long drive every day?
Oh, I didn't do it every day. That's where I was living when I was hired. I moved to Ashland. I lived on Center Street for 3 years in an apartment.
Who were some of the interesting characters in your neighborhood?
Oh, Lord, there was, oh God, what was her name? The sister of Joe Haley lived across the street, across the railroad tracks. And she had a daughter or a niece who lived in the house. And one of them was blind and the other one was not quite in her senses. And I don't think either one of the older lady never left the house. Joe Haley was the man after whom Haley Hall was named. So they were very eccentric. Ms. Mary Byrne, you know about. You know about Ms. Mary Byrne?
A couple of interviewees have mentioned her.
Well, she lived at the other end of the street. Her house is now where the development office is. She was off her rocker. She was very charming. She was known for wearing big straw hats and carrying a walking stick. She was tawdry, as I am. I often carry a walking stick and wear a big straw hat, so I was beginning to get scary. The only time I met her was at the groundbreaking for the Science Building in 1969, and she tottered up to me, and she didn't know me any more than she knew that glass of water, and said out of the blue, "I don't know why they invite me to these things. They all think I have money, and I don't." And she giggled and tottered off. And behind her house, there is, I think, still a cottage. And in 1969 or so, it still had bars on the window, because that's where they kept her father when her father went crazy, so went the tale. That was told to me by a student of mine who, with his wife, lived in that cottage. Next to that was the house of Shirt Blanton, Roseanne says. You know about him?
Yes.
And I remember seeing him. There was a bell in his hallway, and every time the train hit a signal, the bell would ring, and he would pop out like a mechanical toy for a Lionel train set and wave his flashlight at the caboose. The next lot down is just a circle of trees. It's called a house site. You know about what happened there. You know about the murder.
Which murder?
Well, there are only two in Ashland that anybody talks about. This is the murder.
The Smeeman murder? The Smeeman murder?
No. Oh, I'm going to have to think for a minute. Spotswood Keene.
Okay.
You know about that one?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, Spotswood Keene actually died in Shirt Blanton's house. He was shot on that house site by his uncle. The uncle committed suicide in prison, and the story in town was that the brother of the uncle it was an uncle by marriage, smuggled some weapon to him in jail, and he used that weapon to commit suicide, and then the brother who smuggled whatever it was, I've heard a pistol and a razor, died of a heart attack a year later. Well, my family lived in Pennsylvania, and I had just never seen or heard anything like Ashland. I mean, these Gothic stories all up and down the street. So it was very, very strange, a very dark town. I mean, it was literally dark. When you drove up 95 at night and came off the interstate, all lighting ceased. Route 54 was 2 lanes then, I think. And after 9 o'clock, there just weren't any lights. There were some houses on the south side, private residences. They're all gone now. Large colonial style houses, but they're all gone. Their lights would be out. There was a single bulb at the Shell station where the Rite Aid pharmacy is now. There was a little light at the Henry Clay Shopping Center sign. But I mean, it was, you just came off the interstate with all the headlights, and then it was just blackness. It was just blackness. It's very strange.
So that was your first impression of Ashland?
No, that was not the first impression. I don't remember the first impression. I borrowed a car. I came here right after the Martin Luther King riots for an interview, and I was very nervous about taking a bus through Richmond, and I had a very good friend, still have, named Jack Hannon, and he loaned me his Volvo, so I drove over. When I got to the campus, I got here early, and I was just wandering around looking at the place, and I was struck by the fact that I crossed paths with 3 students, and each one of them said hello to me. I thought it was a very friendly school. That's no longer the case here. But I didn't know who I was, but they were just very nice young men. I met George Oliver, who is somebody you should try to interview if possible. You can do it by phone, I guess. He went to college here, and he taught here from the early 50s until the 1990s. And he grew up in Dawswell. He was a member of the Lions Club. I mean, very, very well connected locally. Family goes back to the 17th century, I think. There's a little crossroads in the county called Oliver. Met him. I met Bob Offenbacher, the second person I met here. He taught math. That's somebody else you might want to talk to. He lives across the street from the science building, the side street. And he's a very, very talkative man with a very, very good memory. So he could tell you a lot. Very funny man. He's in the telephone book. 798-4137. Save you trouble looking it up. I met Alec Mabry, who was a very nice man, who was dean of the college at that time. And then I met Luther White. So that was my impression of the college. I don't remember driving over particularly, or driving back particularly. Didn't have Interstate 64, I do remember that. I had to come over on 250, which was a 2-lane road. Not 2 lanes each way, 2 lanes. So if you got behind a truck, you were just stuck for a very long time because there was no passing on it. The nearest shopping center, other than the Henry Clay, was the now vanished Azalea Mall on the north side of Richmond. And if you drove from here to the Azalea Mall, I think you went through 2 traffic lights. There was no traffic light between the one here on Route 54 and the one on Parham Road. And going north, you didn't encounter a traffic light until you got to Fredericksburg. And most of Route 1 was 55 miles an hour or 45 miles an hour. It was 45 miles an hour through Ashland.
What are some of your favorite courses that you taught?
Favorite courses? I had a couple of colloquies that were fun the first couple of times I taught them. And then students began to take advantage of the research time and not do research. And so I gave them up. The first one I taught, the first ever colloquy term, I had the students do research in printed colonial records at various libraries. Each student taking an island in the West Indies and writing a history of that island in the 18th century. And some of the sophomores did absolutely superb jobs, just superb jobs at it. Another course, again a colloquy, it was a huge amount of work, and eventually I gave it up because the students wouldn't do the work that was needed. It was called the American Revolution Research and Role Playing. and the students had 2 weeks to research a person, say Thomas Jefferson or John Adams or Lord North or George III. And in fact, since women were not, and make sure you get this language very carefully because I've been misquoted unfairly, women were not politically important in the 18th century. You know, they didn't vote, didn't hold office. Somebody said, he said women weren't important. I never said that. It was very hard to place a woman in that course. So if I had a woman, I made her George III because people were used to women being monarchs, and that worked very well. And there was a contestant on Jeopardy a couple of years back, and I can't remember her name. And Alec Trebek said, you know, what interesting have you done? And she said, I was once George III in a course in college. Didn't mention me or the college, much to my annoyance. That was a lot of work, but the students got a great deal out of it. And they would do the role playing for 2 weeks, and they would get so into their roles that in the final session where I had them meet together, they were standing on their feet screaming at each other over things that had never happened. I didn't give them historical things to react to because that was too trite. You know, they just look up what so-and-so said about the Stamp Act. No, I'd give them other problems, and they'd get more and more into their roles and get very, very passionate about it. And that's what I was trying to teach them, that people in the past were passionate, and they did things emotionally, not rationally all the time. Without exception, the students who learned the most were the students who had the British side. There were 2 teams, different rooms. They were not allowed to talk to each other. They could only communicate by writing. And the British always learned the most, and they always concluded that the Americans were spoiled and had no reason to rebel. Other courses that I liked, I think my favorite was the Early Republic, 1789 to 1820, because it was a relatively small time period. There were a couple of superb general histories that covered in 2 volumes that period. So I didn't have to do a narrative history. I could do what I think I enjoy doing best, which is biography. And I would take a person, and then how does that person deal with certain problems, like Washington and Jefferson and Madison and so on. I really enjoyed the course. I did a lot of other things in the course as well. All of my courses emphasize writing. And I noticed in the faculty minutes, one of the SGA presidents, who was my advisee as a matter of fact, complaining that there weren't enough instructions from the faculty on the honor system. And I was surprised because I always made a big point of it. And for decades I've been reading Thomas Jefferson's letter to Peter Carr on the importance of honesty. And I remember one student, God, I can't think of his name, and this is 30 years ago. At the start of the spring semester, just with a smile on his face, said, Mr. Scanlon, there are a lot of new people in the course this semester. Are you going to scare them the way you scared us about not cheating? All right, so I have to work myself into a frenzy. The frenzy would end with the statement, if I catch any of you cheating, God help you because I will not. And that, I very rarely had a problem with students, very rarely had a problem. I had a couple of cases of plagiarism that I know of, Stupid things that was just foolish for them to do. I think I made it very clear that I cared deeply about it, and therefore they thought maybe they should. I hope they carried that with them the rest of their lives. I don't know. None of them has ended up in jail that I know of, so that's all right.
What was student life like when you were a professor?
Well, I was professor for 40 years, so it varied enormously. The 70s were a very difficult time for the college, as I suppose you know. But I was talking with some alumni at a meeting and then at dinner, and Professor Malvasi was there. And the alumni and I were telling stories, and we laughed for several hours with these stories. And Professor Malvasi said then and since it sounded like Randolph-Macon was a lot more fun then than it is now. And I guess it is. Of course, I'm much older than the students than I was then. But the younger member of the faculty that I've talked to don't have the kind of rapport that we, and it wasn't just me, that we commonly did. Students used to come by the history department on Friday afternoons because they knew that George and Oliver and I would get bored and start bickering with each other. We used to put on quite a show, every kidding back and forth. And these kids used to just hang out waiting for us to start. They thought we were deadly enemies, some of them. This is so naive. Because we did it every Friday. I remember being invited into dorms to play bridge with students. I played bridge with students because we were supposed to chaperone fraternity parties, and I would play bridge and drink whiskey with them. Michael Carter, who works in the development office, invited me to go canoeing with him, and we had a wonderful day on the river. Is that interrupting your...
It's probably picking it up.
Yeah.
Is that your computer?
Yeah.
Eric can probably edit
I
it
see.
out.
It just does that. I don't know what it's doing, whether there's a fan in there or not.
It's cooling itself off.
Mm.
That's a good thing. We don't want it to overheat.
No, no. No. The students, the males, had hair longer than yours. And some of them had a very druggy appearance. Whether or not they did drugs, of course, I don't know. But one of them subsequently wrote me, when we used to get stoned, we'd go and play hide and go seek in the new science building when it was under construction. One of those long-haired young men, I think I had him in one class, his first name was George, but he didn't go by George. And maybe 10 years ago, I was at intermission in the theater, and this man with 2 children in tow came up to me and said, "Are you Dr. Scanlon?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "I'm George so-and-so." And I said, "Do you mean Rocky so-and-so?" And big grin, "Yes, yes, you remember." "Of course I remember you." "What are you doing now?" I said. And he said, "I'm a judge." Another one of them is a homicide detective. Another one of them is one of the most prominent lawyers in Richmond. They never caused trouble in class. Their work was turned in on time. They graduated in 4 years. So you really can't go by appearances. You just can't go by appearances. I had one student. He did not stay for 4 years. Long-haired, tattered jeans, and one time he was talking, and he just incidentally referred to his father's jet. So, you couldn't tell whether they had money or not. They looked very equal. There is one young man who used to go around with jeans ripped at the knees, long reddish hair. He has been for a number of years chief of staff for a congressman in Washington. So, I mean, you just can't go by appearances. But they were fun. The student, I mean, they could be very aggravating because there were some you knew had potential and they didn't live up to it. Some of them just didn't do the work. They didn't want to do the work. But there were quite a few who were a lot of fun and who did do the work. And I think added something to the luster of Randolph-Macon, wherever they've gone. Later students, Randolph-Macon students are generally polite. I notice if I let students take the extra 10 minutes to finish a test, the students in the next class will wait outside until they finish. They don't come barging in and disturb things. They're polite. They're very nice to deal with in class for the most part. Get some who behave like high school students and pass notes back and forth. But that's very, very, very rare. They could study a whole lot more than they do. They could study a whole lot more. But they're usually polite. I've had many students to my house for dinner, and sometimes whole classes. When I taught the colonial course, I would have the class to dinner, sometimes maybe 10 people. For an 18th century dinner, I'd use Jefferson's recipes for chicken and potatoes and vegetables. When I have individuals coming to dinner, they would usually, I don't think I ever have an instance of a student who said he would come and didn't turn up. Other professors have given up inviting students to class because they'd say they would come and then nobody would turn up. And the man would have spent all day preparing the meal. But I never had that problem. Now, I had some back off, but they'd let me know. And very often, if they came to dinner, they would be very presentable, wearing a jacket, not necessarily a tie, but a jacket. Some of them would bring a bottle, not an expensive bottle, but a bottle of wine. And they're very well behaved. Professor Curry, who's no longer here, sadly, is a lovely man. He returned to another school where they gave him tenure. He was on a tenure track here, but he really wanted to be at the other school, and they offered him a tenure track there, and he went. He had taught in Connecticut at Fairfield University, and he said that the students at Fairfield, now Connecticut's a rich state, didn't seem to know how to act when they came and talked to professors. And the difference he saw between them and our students was that our students were more comfortable talking to professors, and more at ease.
How do you think the rise of car ownership has affected student involvement in the town? Now that every student seems to own a car, do you think they're more attached?
Judy and I were talking about this, not about the cars, but about the boarding houses yesterday. Until, I think, 1946, but mid-40s, early after the war, the college here did not have a dining hall, and students boarded in town. And some boarded, and not roomed, but boarded. They ate their meals, and of course, certain ladies had reputations of being better cooks than others, and they would get filled up first. That probably put a lot of students more in contact with the town. Once the dining hall was built, that contact was severed. Now, and Offenbacher is the person who told me this. Faculty members continued to board, not live, but to go out and get meals with ladies in the town. And he did that through the 50s. But you really ought to talk to Bob. He has a very good memory. And that practice was not happening when I came in '68, or if it was, nobody told me. So there was more and more loss of contact. I don't think the cars had anything to do with it. You talk to the older alumni pre-World War II. I used to interview them at the old grads affair. I did that for a number of years. We should have tapes on it. I don't recall that they talked much about relations with the town. There wasn't much to do here. There was a movie theater. It's what used to be Sullivan's on the railroad track. Before that, it was a Mexican restaurant. somewhere along there it was a gym. I knew it as an office supply and gift shop. And if you look on the wall that faces south, you can see the outline of a stairway going up. And I think that's where the blacks had to sit, up in that balcony. Then the Ashland Theater was built 48, 49, something like that. But that was about it. The shopping center, Henry Clay Shopping Center, is early 60s. So there wasn't a whole lot here. There wasn't a whole lot here in 1968, really. There was Crosses. There was a very nice store run by two very nice ladies that sold household goods. I would have to go in if I needed something for the kitchen next to Crosses. Very nice ladies. I don't remember their names. They were very nice. Well, they went out of business, and a lot of them business. The only businesses that have survived have been Crosses and Coon's Barbershop. You know, if you go back 50 years, the rest are all pretty much gone. I think all of them are gone. So I don't think there was much contact. Before we went co-ed, I used to joke that all you heard Friday afternoon was the slamming of car doors and trunk lids. You just hear bam, bam, bam as students got in their cars and drove off to other universities where they had girlfriends or other friends. And Professor Reinhardt and I used to joke about how empty the place was on weekends, and you almost imagined tumbleweeds blowing through. I mean, it was really empty on the weekends, really empty. And unless there were big weekends. And when I lived on South Center Street, and I lived the next to the last house in town, and there were some Saturday nights where I could hear the parties, and it was about a mile away. I could hear the parties and hear voices in the parties. They were very, very, very loud. But other weekends, the place would clear out. And when the school went co-ed, it had the effect of retaining students on the weekends. The college tried to keep students on the weekends. There used to be films, fairly recent films, shown in Blackwell Auditorium. There were entertainers on the weekends, but not every weekend. The school didn't have the money for it.
Were there any town complaints of the partying?
I'm sure there were. I didn't hear any. I remember that the Mitchells, who lived, it's now is it the Kappa Alpha Theta, next to the Theta Chi's?
No, it's the Phi Mu's.
That's the Phi Mu's house. That house was owned by a married couple named Mitchell, and they were both deaf. So it didn't matter very much, I think, to them. You would sometimes hear complaints by the people who lived on College Avenue after Hardee's was built, that students would go down the street to Hardee's and walking down and make a lot of noise. And one night a lot of car doors were kicked in. The assumption was it was college students who did it, but you don't know that. You just don't know that. There not a lot of contact between the two communities. I asked Margaret Miller, Schuyler Miller's wife, on this very point about he came in 1940, about social life. And she said that the faculty weren't paid enough to entertain. And consequently, there was very little social action between the townspeople and the faculty. And she said that most of the faculty then were either bachelors or childless couples. And I have observed over the years that one of the strongest elements of social cohesion in a community is the school systems, because it brings parents together. And I've known people to make friendships with the parents of a classmate of their daughter or son. And then when the students go to different schools for whatever reason, that relationship ends. So if you have a faculty that don't have much participation in the school system, that's a very important bond that doesn't exist for tying the faculty to the town, and they don't get involved in social life because they don't have the money. It's been fairly recently that members of the faculty or staff have run for town council. Roseanne Scholf was appointed to fill a vacancy. And she had one time worked for the college. I'm not sure if she was working for the college when she was on town council or not. Anthony Keat was elected. George Spagna was elected. But that's all been fairly recent. And Randolph-Macon didn't pay enough in my time for the faculty to live in Ashland. Ashland, a banker, Jimmy Dooley, president of the Hanover National Bank, told me that he took a set of plans to a builder in Richmond and one in Ashland, and the same building would cost $5,000 more to build in Ashland than in Richmond. And a house at that time, let's say, would cost about $30,000. So building in Ashland, for some reason, was about 15% more expensive. So since the faculty weren't being paid enough to live here on their own salaries, they scatter. They scatter. Now, I came just at the time when it was becoming common for wives to work, but that hadn't hit Randolph-Macon. Faculty wives were kind of expected to be hostesses at college functions, to serve punch. That's what they did. A friend of mine, well, two friends, married couple, both taught here. She was the first woman to teach here. Penny Bledsoe. She taught Spanish and ran the language lab. And Penny used to just get incensed when she'd be asked to serve punch at some college function because she was a faculty wife. She was a member of the faculty herself, and people just couldn't grasp that. But the rest, Neil Oliver taught, and the Olivers lived in Fredericksburg because George thought it was better for him to commute the distance than her. She got caught in a snowstorm. It took her 5 hours to get home one time. But Beth Baskin didn't have a job. Carl Baskin was head of the economics department. Mrs. Mabry didn't work. Mrs. White didn't work. I don't think Mrs. Howard worked. I'm trying to remember who was the faculty when I came here. Frank Howard taught education. Noble McEwen's wife, I don't think, had a job. He taught psychology. Mrs. Panel, you've talked to Mrs. Panel?
No.
You've got to talk to Mrs. Panel. Oh, you absolutely have to talk to Mrs. Panel. Because she's very interested in the college. Very smart, very sharp lady. She lives at Hanover Manor. I don't know her number. Hanover Manor is on Route 54 as you're going out of town, not quite opposite the Baptist church. But she'd be an excellent person for you to talk to. Her husband was the philosophy department, very, very highly regarded figure. The Honors House is named after him, the Panel House. Mrs. Panel didn't work. Pat Kuntz is, I think, a CPA or something like that. I think she had a job. I'm just trying to remember who was in my building. Doc McConnell's wife didn't work. Munyon wasn't married. I'm not. Reinhardt isn't. Offenbacher isn't. I don't think Mrs. Moore worked. Ron Moore was chairman of the math department. not sure if Stuart Monroe, I think Stuart Monroe's wife worked at one time and then didn't. He taught chemistry. Margaret Miller, I don't think, worked. So wives weren't expected to work. In fact, they were kind of expected not to.
What was the college initial reaction to going co-ed?
Well, you have to understand that the college went co-ed because of a serious loss of students. It was not something that the president wanted to do, apparently, but did out of desperation. There were female students here. I remember before we went co-ed, I had one class with 3 in it. That's somebody else you should talk to. Dickie Ludwig. Her married name is McGovern. I think her husband, both of them are physicians. She and her husband are both physicians. She lives on College Avenue. He may be George McGovern, but I'm not sure of that. But her mother was Linda Ludwig, and she was a town resident. And so the daughter came to Randolph-Macon for a while, and she'd be a wonderful person to talk to, because she grew up in Ashland. Have you talked to Woody Tucker?
Yes.
Okay, because his old Ashland family. Anyway, for me, having co-eds in class was not therefore that big a change. It was expected that women would raise the tone of the student body, that they're more serious about studies and less destructive. I leave that judgment to you, whether or not that assessment was correct. But that was, I thought, the case at the time, that that the women, were less likely to cause problems than the males. The men did not cause problems in class. It's when they over-celebrated something in the dormitories and got upset about something and smashed the walls and broke their hands. I had several instances where I had students who had to be given some sort of special treatment for finals because they'd broken their hands, smashed a wall or something with it. Women, I think, have more sense than that.
Mm-hmm.
I heard one woman of that time later say, and she didn't explain it, she said, "We thought we would be welcomed with open arms." I'm not sure what they were expecting. The college did what it could to make things comfortable for them. They were given probably the most desirable dormitory, which was Mary. Well, it's a toss-up whether Moreland or Mary Branch was more desirable. I think Mary Branch is the nicer dorm. But it was not air conditioned at the time. It was also elevated, so it was safer. But it was a matter of adjusting. I remember one professor who had been in the Navy and could be quite bawdy in his language. He had to be very much more careful because he didn't want to offend any of the ladies. But it was a transition as far as the academic program that was fairly smooth. Where there was controversy, of course, was the matter of could males go into female dormitories. And I have a very long section on that subject. It's in my briefcase. It's in chapter 1 if you want to look at it. The president said, no, well, they could go on the weekends up till midnight or something like that. And
Didn't the women have a rally?
well, there was a student rally.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it was just women. They marched around. But I have that. That's all covered. Read that section.
She has.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
That's where the question came from.
Well, it wasn't just the women. It was students. There was a young man. I cannot recall his name. A very good student, as I recall, who flouted the rules by going to a co-ed dorm and sitting in the lounge and having a pizza. And the president threw him out for that. And I don't know what school he went to after that, but he ended up being a prominent attorney in Richmond. So, I mean, it made the policy of the president made the students very unhappy, and some said that they were leaving because of it. And retention was a problem. And as that policy was in fact, but not officially abandoned, the enrollment numbers go up. I think what he wanted to do was morally correct. I cannot fault his morality. But he was certain, this is Luther White, he was certainly flying in the face of popular sentiments, and not just at Randolph-Macon, but nationally. When I was in college, women were allowed in the dorms only when you were a freshman and your mother came in, on the day you moved in. Women were not allowed in the dorms at other times. And we students had to be in by certain hours, and the hours got later as your career went on. And it was not until my senior year that Georgetown gave up having hours when you had to be in your room. And it was checked. There were law students and medical students who lived on every floor, and they got free rooms. But every night at whatever the time was, they would have to go room by room with a clipboard and check off and make sure you were there. I had a friend who went to Oberlin that I met in graduate school, and I asked him about, did they have such a rule? It was old-fashioned even then. He said, no, we didn't need one because the women had to be in their dorms by 10 o'clock. This was in the early 1960s. And so if the women had to be in their dorms, there was nothing for the boys to do but go back to their dorms. Whatever I don't know what they did. Oberlin's a very fine school. Very fine school. I remember my Aunt Peg telling a story of her daughters who went to universities in Ohio. And she was saying that the girls would hear their friends walking up this sidewalk, and they're going to be late, and don't they know they were very anxious that their friends get in the dorm before the dreaded hour of 10 o'clock, whenever the time was. So in the 1950s, parietal hours were very, very, very serious at the schools I was familiar with. But in the 1970s, well, Georgetown was old-fashioned even for its times, but such things in the 1970s were virtually unheard of.
There were accounts of, I guess, fights between locals, townies, rednecks, and students. Could you tell me more about that?
I can't. Well, you mean for the interview?
Yes.
I'm sorry. You don't mean more than what I've written?
No. What do you
Okay.
think were the causes?
Oh, that's a very profound question, to which I'm going to give a very shallow answer. In the 70s, male college students were privileged, and their privilege was they weren't eligible for the draft. They had to, and we had deferments. I think that was resented. And the badge of being a college student was to have long hair, when working class people did not. And so college students stood out more visibly than they do today. And so they were resented, and apparently, judging by the reports in the Yellow Jackets, from time to time they would be attacked. And the Yellow Jacket reports one freshman and his brother being attacked. It's not clear from the account if they were walking or driving when they were followed by a car full of apparently locals and attacked. I don't know to what extent there was damage done to them, but the freshman was reported in the paper that after the local people left, he and his brother ran like hell. That young man became an advisee of mine. I didn't remember the instant when I had him, because he was a freshman when that happened. He became an advisee later, and he's now one of the most prominent Richmond attorneys. He's also on the Board of Trustees. There would apparently be fights outside of Andy's. Andy's, I think, was started with an eye to capturing the college trade. And a number of businesses have tried that. Andy's is the place that has survived for 40 years. But other businesses have tried to capture the student trade. The problem is there's not a very big summer school, and for a long time there was no summer school. So there's no business from the students in June, July, and August. So the places either went out of business or locals filled that ecological niche, so to speak. Then when the college students would come back, there would be a conflict. And usually the college students would back off. Now, a lot of the young men here are pretty big and pretty strong. And I was puzzled why they would back off. And I was talking to a friend of mine, a native of Richmond, and he said, for the local roughnecks, if they get arrested, it doesn't mean anything. You know, their friends get arrested and it's kind of a badge of honor. But college students, particularly middle-class college students, that's not something that's acceptable to them. And so even though they're physically big and strong, psychologically they don't want to deal with it, and they tend to be driven off. And I've heard numerous accounts, or several accounts, of fights outside of the pool hall. Is it rack time?
Break time.
Break time, thank you. Between locals and Randolph-Macon students, although the Randolph-Macon students continue to go there, but they stopped going to Andy's. And I have breakfast once a week in Andy's, and there was a time when I was doing physical therapy in the same mall, and I would go to lunch at Andy's, and it's an absolutely perfectly respectable place and serves good food. But in the evening, it is a bar, and people. Well, I knew one restaurant owner, and local, and he told me that a number of his customers said, "Why don't you serve beer?" And he said, I don't want to serve beer. He said, I don't want the trouble. If you serve beer, then you always have problems. So, more serious than the kind of the peripheral problems, when female students got so numerous they could not all be housed in Mary Branch, they began to be moved into new dorm and to some of the motel dorms, and those buildings lack elevation. The rooms are at ground level, and they're more inviting psychologically. You know, to get into Mary Branch, you have to walk up steps, and you have to kind of go into that courtyard, and it's a little bit forbidding, whereas the motel dorms, as I insist on calling them, the Northern Residential Campus, or whatever euphemism the administration now likes, is what I'm talking about. The Freshman Village. All euphemisms become dysphemisms, but people won't learn that lesson. The motel dorms are much more inviting. And so, again, judging by the Yellow Jacket, and since the Dean of Students office doesn't apparently keep records, there were more intrusions what happens, I think, but I haven't found the documentation yet, in the Payne era was to go to co-ed dorms. And male students are very territorial. And I would never go into a dorm unless I was specifically asked by a student. And even then, tell that student to meet me at the entrance. I wouldn't just go in. Because you get all sorts of hostile looks, even though they know who I am. So, non-students going into a dorm are going to be spotted instantly. And I asked Jeff Johnson, a student of mine some years back, how can you tell? And he said, if they're looking for room numbers, they don't belong here. Because after the first week, you know where your friends are. So, having the males and the females together protected the females. And the incidence of off-campus males going into female dormitories has dropped off quite a lot. You can see it building in the Yellow Jacket in 78, 79, 77, 78. Then I think it's going to, I haven't got into that yet, but I'm pretty sure it's going to drop off once you go to co-ed dorms. The other thing, the lady who made one of the quilts out on the stairwell, Julia Pfaff, when she made that quilt in 1990, we were talking, and she went to the University of Toronto. And she said she was in a co-ed dorm. So we must have gone about 1990, because I guess it was something I was talking about. And she said that the males and females in a co-ed dorm do not date each other. That they treat each other as more like brothers and sisters. And there's a study of Rutgers, and the author of that study made the same observation. He put it a little bit more strongly. There's kind of an incest taboo against dating people in the same dormitories. So I'm sure there were pious people just shocked by it, but in point of fact, it does not produce the kind of misbehavior they feared, and indeed is more protective of the women, I think.
Where did you find your inspiration to write about the history of Randolph-Macon?
Oh, I was asked to do it for, oh Lord, I'm trying to remember the dates. It was for the 150th anniversary of the charter. Of course, they didn't get around to it until 1979. A number of other people had been asked and turned them down. I thought George Oliver should have written it, and I said that to him 3 times. Won't you write this? No, I don't want to write it. So a friend of mine, Paul Mattingly, said, if you ever get a chance to write an institutional history, do it. And so I remembered that, and so I thought, well, I will try, see if I can do it. I only had 15 months to research and write it, and so there were a lot of things I would have liked to have looked at and couldn't. A lot of passages I wish I had time to improve. I wrote the draft on a typewriter, and then after a while, with all its corrections, I gave it to a lady to type up, and then edited that. And of course, when you do it that way, if you find new information, you have to type it on a separate piece of paper and mark it insert A for page such and such. And then on page such and such, you have to mark insert A. I had to change all the footnote numbers by hand, and additions are always at the beginning of the chapter, never at the end, so it meant changing all the footnotes. The drafts are in the archives, and you can go and you can see what it was like. The amazing thing to me about using the computer is that the footnotes automatically renumber. And you can move things around so easily. Computers can be cranky and contrarian, cause problems. But I realized in doing my editing that I had the discussion of the 1968 mission statement, different things about it in 2 different chapters. And I thought, oh, this is silly. So I just and I think that's what I was doing the day you came by. I just took a big chunk from chapter 3 and put it into chapter 2. And then, of course, the footnotes magically disappeared and reappeared in exact numerical sequence. It's utter. I had a chemistry professor, F.O. Rice, and F.O. Rice fought in the First World War. And he was an old man when I had him. And he would say that these technological innovations are utterly fantastic and hard to believe. You have this little black box and you turn it on and you get words and music throughout the whole room. He's talking about the radio. He doesn't know about the television. And yet here I am. The computer is utterly fantastic and hard to believe because I remember a time when we didn't have it. In fact, I'm going to bore you with a story. I was a pioneer in the computer business. I worked for a data processing company, and computers were enormously expensive. Enormously expensive. And most businesses couldn't afford them. And the business I worked for collected data, and a lady key punched it. And my job was to take the cards. You know what the key punch card is? No, you don't know what an IBM card is. An IBM card was 6 inches long, or 7 inches long, and about 4 inches high. And it had 70 columns or 80 columns. And holes would be punched in it in vertical columns. And then as that card went through a machine, there would be however many copper fingers that rested against the card, and as the card went through where the card had a hole, that copper finger would touch a roller and make an electrical contact. So memory was in the form of cards. The college computer had a 48K memory, 48,000 bytes, 48,000. And computers cost roughly $1 a byte. So a 64K machine cost $64,000. They were enormously expensive, and memory storage was in these cards. And so my job was to carry the trays of cards, which I put into boxes and tie the boxes up with string, put them on a dolly, and carry them down the street by hand to another building where the man leased a computer on the weekends because the bank didn't know what to do with it on the weekends. And that was in 1966, 1967. I did not get a personal computer until 1983. And I remember one of my students, who's now in his 40s and a businessman, he told me I was the first person he ever knew who had a personal computer. And it had a 64K memory. And it was a K-Pro. It was very, very fancy stuff. And I got that computer just as the book came out, and it would have made doing the first volume remarkably easier. But it was a much more cumbersome system than the current one. Mm-hmm. If you wanted to print in italics, you would have to hit the @ sign and the letter I and a parenthesis and then the word and then a parenthesis. And if you forgot the second parenthesis, everything would be in italics. So you in a sense had to do some programming just to write. But it wasn't true programming. And there was a time when we thought that everybody was going to have to learn programming, because that's the way you did things on computers. You had to learn programming, and we had programming courses here. And of course the programming is all done for you now. And formatting. When you wrote something, you had to go through another's, you had to put in a different disk and do the formatting. And of course now that's all done. So the computer is an enormous change. And I think there were 3 faculty secretaries. Maybe not that many, maybe 2. And when I came, there was a faculty of about 60. Well, now there's a faculty of about 100 plus maybe 50 adjuncts. And there are 3 faculty secretaries. Because what has happened is that we have become our own secretaries. I'm a terrible typist. And if I wanted to write a letter of recommendation or write the faculty minutes, I typed a draft and then gave it, in case of the minutes, gave it to Mary Maxwell to type up for the book. I'm just an awful typist. But later on, I would just do it on the computer and then take the disc over, and she would print it. She had a good printer. Then she would proofread it for me. And then, of course, the later stage was just to send it by email. So, and if I had letters of recommendation, I would take them to somebody to write. Well, now I do them myself, so it's money saving in that sense. Not, of course, the obvious thing was science and the rest of it, and statistics, but just in the day-to-day logistics of doing paperwork, it's made an enormous difference. And how many more faculty secretaries would we have had to have if we didn't have the computer?
Who gave you the most contribution as far as research goes? Like, where did you get your research?
Oh, here. The key source is the trustee minutes. They give you most of the facts. They're not always reliable, particularly in the 60s and 70s, because the trustees appear to do things that don't happen. I call them pseudo decisions. They vote to do something and then it doesn't happen. And if you only went by the trustee minutes, you would think something had happened, and years later you find that they're still talking about whatever it was they were supposed to do. Faculty minutes are important depending on the period. In the 50s, the faculty secretary used to lead the faculty meeting after an hour. So you could get faculty minutes that are a paragraph long. My minutes can run anywhere from 1 to 8 pages, depending on the length of the meeting. And I was secretary for 29 years. Student publications are very important. I didn't have time to go through all the Yellow Jackets of the period. I did read through the magazines in the 19th century. There are not as many of them. They give you wonderful insights into student life, and I've gone through all of the Yellow Jackets for the current project to 1979. I'm doing it by periods. They're enormously important. Yearbooks, although they are of diminishing importance because there's less information in them. And the yearbook, I think, is going to, as not just at Randolph-Macon, but everywhere, is going to disappear. VCU, I think, has stopped issuing a yearbook. There's almost nothing in the way of student notes and faculty lectures. I tried to give my student notes, which were very thorough, to Georgetown. The archivist didn't want them. Couldn't see the reason for them. I knew the director of the library, and he said that he would accept them, and that's how they got in. I don't think anybody's ever used them. The historian of Georgetown has not, because I've read his manuscript. So I don't know why I bothered, but maybe somebody else someday will want to see what a student was taking in the way of notes. Trying to think of what else. The Herald Progress is useful. But what I do with it is, if there's something going on at the college and I can find a date, then I go, or send John Robertson to go and look up that period. I simply do not have time to do what you've done and sit down and read through all the Herald Progresses. I just don't have time to do it. But it is useful. Auditors' accounts are very important, but they're also very confusing. Financial records are, you would think, would be simple and clear, and the financial records of the college are different. And I don't know if you read the passage that I quote. It's in executive committee minutes, and it seems to be more or less a transcript of a discussion. And these are not the right numbers, but somebody says, so the $90,000 is the $147,000, and somebody else says that's right. And then there's a similar passage, because somebody is trying to compare the treasurer's figures with the alumni office figures, and they're wildly apart. And then that group goes on and discusses something else. It's never reconciled. The development office talks, we got so much in gifts this year, but they, I think, count pledges, and the auditor's reports don't. So when you see a number, you don't really know what it means. And the auditor's reports aren't as simple as you might think. I asked Kathy Staples, the professor of accounting, to go over them with me, and she said they're different than a corporate financial report because this is a nonprofit, and so she can only think that it means something. She isn't exactly sure, but they're very important. For instance, throughout the 1930s, Randolph-Macon reported an endowment of $1 million. In fact, that number was a fiction. It was based on counting stocks at the purchase price, which of course was off by 90%. Not that we had that. Most of the endowment was in mortgages in the 1920s and 30s. But the trustees borrowed from the endowment for operating expenses. And a debt is an asset. So if you borrow from the endowment, you owe the endowment, and that debt that you owe the endowment is an asset for the endowment. Therefore, the numbers don't change. So instead of having $1 million, they had $300,000 or something like that. The mortgages defaulted, and so they ended up owning real estate. So you get some of that information from the auditor's reports. You don't get it from other records. So in the first volume, there's a treasure trove here called the Early Papers. John Early was the first president of the board, and it was just a goldmine of information about why the Methodists wanted a college. And you can see it. They tried to have a reading program and examinations of the ministers, and it didn't work. It just didn't work. So if they wanted to have educated ministers, they had to have a college. That's in the Early Papers. It's nowhere else. People were very important. The project would be much, much, much more difficult if it weren't for the people. Flavie Owen just knew the collection very well and knew Methodism very well. It was very helpful. The archives, other than the Early Papers, were just in that, whatever you call that room, with no windows down the hall. And it was in no order. There were broken tables and chairs in there, and walking sticks and cabinets and file drawers. The Blackwell papers were heaped up in a crumbling, abandoned dormitory room. And I mean heaped up. The pile started at chest height at the door and went up to the ceiling. I had student assistants go through it and try to pull out things. And some of them worked at it, others just gave up and they didn't do anything. So there was a lot here that I simply didn't have access to because it just was in buried under tons of paper. Judy is wonderfully helpful. She knows the collection cold and can find things. It would take me days to find. She can find it in a few minutes. I mean, you're really in this kind of job where you're working with archival material dependent very much on the archivist because they know where things are. But people, I keep saying this over and over again, Randolph-Macon is important because of the people. And that's something the college needs constantly to keep before it. If you change the people, you change the institution. The institution isn't buildings. The buildings are empty. Buildings are meaningless, except as symbols. But functionally, they're without people in them doing their jobs, they're no use.
Which presidents do you think fostered the best relationships with the town?
I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't know. I just don't know. White, as you know, was very much involved with the Methodist Church. And so to the extent that there was a Methodist presence in town, there was that connection, and other people from the college also with the Methodist Church back in the 60s and 70s. Payne, less so. I think he wanted to have relations. There would be sporadic committees founded to foster relations, but I can't say that it's been very systematically pursued. A friend of mine had 2 kids graduate from Patrick Henry High, and scholarships are announced at graduation. And that friend, and I'm sure he's told various presidents this, always thought it would create a very good impact on the community if Randolph-Macon announced a scholarship to a senior at the local high school. But I don't think we do that. I know the president, that President Payne, wanted to close off Henry Street. This is something that goes back to the 60s, this idea. And the way he went about it produced an outcry of opposition from the people in Berkeley town. And I don't think he knew how to get access to the African American community of Berkeley town. And I thought it could have been done through people who worked in the library, because there were a couple of ladies who worked here who came from prominent African American families, and they would know who to know. But I don't think that was ever pursued. So I think we tend to react to crises. The town can really hamper the college, and has. We mentioned earlier the Spotswood Keene shooting. The President White bought that house where the shooting occurred and wanted it for the, I think, Kappa Sigma fraternity house. He was a lawyer. He should have known better. But you just can't build a fraternity house in a residential neighborhood, even though it's across the street from the campus. And the neighbor, Mr. Blanton, objected to having a fraternity house next to him. And so, as I said, there's a circle of trees there where a house used to be. That never happened. One of my landladies here in town told me that the townspeople didn't like the college because none of this land paid taxes. And if only the college weren't here, then the town would have more money. So there's that kind of resentment.
There's a term called calicoing. Could you explain that to me? Local girls dating college students?
I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that term. Is it in my book? Because I don't remember
yes.
it. I don't remember it.
Was there many accounts of college students dating local girls?
There's not much. There's not much. You do get some, but I mean, it's just student social life, Kim, is very, very hard to pin down. G.K. Chesterton says somewhere that newspapers consist entirely of exceptions. And that's a much more elegant way of what I told my students for years, but I did see it independently of reading him. That when you read headlines, you read enough of them and you begin to think that the headlines reflect what is common. But the fact that it's a headline means it's unusual. And my favorite example, and I didn't save it, was a top of the fold on the Metro section of the Richmond paper some years ago, man killed on I-81. And there was this long story about a car accident on Interstate 81. A man was killed. On page 5 or 7, somewhere buried in the paper, there was the usual story, the roundup of the number of automobile fatalities of the previous day or two. And there were 5 people killed, and they were all killed on country roads. And if you read the paper systematically, and I do, the overwhelming majority of fatalities are on country roads. Single drivers, they go off the road, they hit a tree, they're ejected from the car because they're not wearing a seatbelt. That's I think 40% of fatalities are trees. But the headline is man killed on I-81. People, as a rule, do not bother to write down what everybody knows. And so normal patterns of student life are not recorded. And you only get it incidentally to other things. I've never seen, I haven't been keeping close touch in the last few years, I've never seen historians take court records to try to tease out ordinary life. Because court records usually have testimony of what somebody was doing just before something happened. And I remember reading an extract from a court record, and I've forgotten what it was about, that the thing that caught my eye was the reference to the husband was walking the baby. This is in the 18th century. The husband was walking the baby. Well, that's not the picture you get of 18th century domestic life. But it happened, and it probably happened much more often than we think. Well, one example I used, there was a rape of a unconscious woman, not a student, in the late 1960s at a fraternity house. And there was a huge outcry that she had been raped, and justly so. The outcry suggests that such things were not common. But it also suggests that unconscious women at fraternity parties were not uncommon. You know, it wasn't people that were upset that a woman drank so much that she passed out. That was mentioned without comment. It's just that, oh, somebody attacked her, which people were just upset. And they couldn't bring themselves to write about it. You could tell something had happened by the sputtering and the ranting and the raving. It's only in later issues that you find out what really went on. So, as I tried to do in the first chapter of this work, is to get a sense of student life. In the other book, I think it's the 3rd chapter or something like that, what was student life like, and it's very, very elusive, very elusive.
Do you have any questions?
Well, I'm glad I could fill up your 10 minutes that you've allotted for this.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome, Kim.